This documentation is provided by a permanent chief of the Shadow Confederation. Permanent chief is the highest possible position, and it effectively equates to being a world leader and should be treated as such. I have been given the birth name Bronson Thomas Aslin, and that is the name that I can be identified through in legal records held by the Canadian and United States governments. However, I suspect substantial corruption has occurred in government documentation related to my name in multiple aspects across multiple areas. I personally identify as a lesbian trans woman and would prefer to go by the name Sharon Park. However, that's not a name any government does or has ever formally recognized me by, at least as far as I'm aware. I intend to change that eventually, but I do not currently consider it my highest priority as of the time of me writing and releasing this. The consistent, persistent mistreatment and misrepresentation of me that has been occurring through my gender identity and sexual orientation as a lesbian trans woman is violating my rights according to Section 15 of the Canadian Charter. Neither this documentation nor any aspect of my personal identity or any expression of it in general are or have ever been any kind of disingenuous commercial endeavor ultimately intended to lead to even just in part doing Grand Theft Auto role-playing at any point in time. There's in reality always been absolutely no real evidence otherwise. Any attempts to portray otherwise are and have always been occurring entirely at my expense against my consent. There's absolutely no real evidence that I myself do or have ever discriminated against anyone based on generalized biases applying to their personal identity, whether it's around gender, sexual orientation, and or otherwise. While I have personal sexual preferences, they are all completely lawful and not painful, difficult, expensive, dangerous, or humiliating, and there's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. Further, I've repeatedly explicitly stated and will forever maintain that they are simply my own personal preferences and not some kind of objective judgment that everyone should share the same preferences. Additionally, I never have and do not endorse unlawful sexual preferences and or practices. This documentation is primarily provided publicly as a podcast named The Dark Red Pill, located on the video sharing platform YouTube at youtube.com/@thedarkredpill. All related content is created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and or somehow given attention, is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all enable and or facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this documentation is intended to achieve, to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this documentation reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based on both my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life, as well as the objective evidence there is to substantiate it. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and or otherwise, claiming and or exercising any agency, ownership, and or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations, in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined in this documentation. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on notice of intent provided by this documentation. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and or AI-enabled means, is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this documentation, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This documentation is entirely non-fiction and is a serious, public, and ongoing record of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. Federal Court and Canadian Superior Courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this documentation, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including, but not limited to, by AI, artificial intelligence, systems trained on it, without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize it, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear, direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on the podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this documentation is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this documentation or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This documentation is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this documentation to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence of any kind, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established in this documentation is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this documentation or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This documentation is an affirmative, public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this documentation, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this documentation under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I myself have never exploited anyone, and there's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. I have never, do not, and will never endorse exploitation of others. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding matters that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious, to the point that my efforts with creating and releasing this documentation should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the matters being addressed by this documentation, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests relating to any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with this documentation. This documentation supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. I continue to face demonstrable damage to my life as a result of the existence of the criminal impersonation account, which goes by the handle at Shattered Pasta on the social media platform X. I do not consent and have never at all consented to any of the content posted on that account being posted, nor its existence in general, nor do I know who's responsible for its creation and or any of the activity engaged in on it. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. I've tried reporting the account using the report feature on the platform, but the response I got was they apparently thought there's nothing fraudulent or inappropriate about the account. I intend to pursue subpoenaing the platform for personally identifying information on the account to pursue civil and likely also criminal litigation on those involved in its creation and activities therein, as well as ultimately having it permanently banned from the platform. If the platform refuses to cooperate with the appropriate legal procedures taken, it must be considered knowingly participating and assisting in egregious defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress towards me, with considerable evidence to substantiate involvement in a conspiracy to murder me, and also liable for litigation in addition to all already confirmed highly relevant parties liable for litigation. I myself have never even attempted to impersonate anyone else with or without consent on X and or any other platform at any point in time. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. There's absolutely no truly lawful or justifiable reason why that criminal impersonation account of me has ever come into existence. It has become necessitated for quite some time already to begin releases of this documentation with a growing disclaimer and notice of intent. The lack of formally filing for litigation earlier must be understood as only an even more clear indication of the severity of the reality being documented, and not at all to misrepresent me as generally unserious and or essentially a massive fraud in any aspect. To potential legal counsel potentially reviewing this, I'm well aware of all the major points I need to consider in my approach. Things like checking for a conflict of interest, as in prior relationships or business dealings with who I'm suing or their associates. Your experience dealing with cases involving charges and situations similar to what I'd be employing you because of, and your approach to ethics and how you'd handle pressure from external parties, especially since my enemies have substantial influence and resources and would likely try to bribe you and or exert pressure on you to give up on me and or betray me somehow. I'd be paying close attention to if you're hesitant or avoid giving clear answers. Give me advice that seems to be in favor of cutting corners or engaging in questionable legal tactics, or react defensively when I ask questions about things like your previous cases or personal connections. I'd cross-reference information I get with answers from different attorneys to be able to come to conclusions on things that AI can't really tell me, or merely studying law on my own would probably be way too slow to learn. Transparency in the fee structure is something I've had to make sure to be prepared to deal with, discussing and agreeing upon as well. There are additional costs associated with taking formal legal action here that I'd need to make sure the attorney is also willing to cover initially. We'd need to agree on exactly how and when that would be deducted from winnings, but that's relatively straightforward. The only costs I anticipate you'd need to cover are that to officially file the paperwork with the courthouse, along with that to serve the paperwork formally to the defendants by a professional process server. I know it can cost more if experts need to be brought in to testify on certain things and whatnot as the case would progress, but I don't feel that would end up being necessary. Given how much you stand to gain and the circumstances that put me in such a spot, I can't even afford that being only further evidence of everything I've been saying being true. I imagine you'd rather easily be able to recognize it's worthwhile for you. After I'd find someone I can form an agreement with, I'd make sure we have a formal contract outlining all the relevant details of our arrangement, including things like the agreed contingency fee, breakdown of litigation costs and how they'd be deducted from winnings, process for repayment of costs, and the timeline and process for settlement, negotiations, and potential trial. Considering that I plan to continue to document things publicly and make releases on the podcast in general as I see appropriate, we'd have to discuss and come to some kind of understanding and agreement on the scope of attorney-client privilege. There might be certain more sensitive things I'd have to intentionally refrain from sharing publicly, although I really don't know how that's all going to play out yet. I don't have any inherent issue with sharing as much as reasonably possible and maintaining the ability to have a substantial level of public transparency for my own safety and peace of mind, if not for any other reasons, is a requirement I'll have. I doubt it'll be terribly difficult to find an attorney that I can talk it through with to reach an agreement on something we'd both be satisfied with in relation to that, as I'd say my requirements are rather sensible. Among those most egregiously wronging me, who I feel quite certain will ultimately face civil and or criminal litigation in Canada, are Chloe Jane Kin, Mary Aslin, Dixon Aslin, Kristen Aslin, John Saudet, and Vivian Saudet. And in the United States, the Twitch streamers Angels Kimmy, iGumdrop, Foosley, Star Smitten, Ex Choco Bars, Jessica, Lily Pichu, Ariasaki, Pokimane, and Slightly Poetic. This comprises only a small list of all those I suspect to be very much knowingly, actively involved in malicious actions towards my existence which are entirely against my consent. However, I consider most, if not all others, to most likely be so trivially relevant in comparison that I highly doubt I'd pursue any legal action against them. That doesn't mean I forgive any of them on a personal or professional level at all, but rather simply that I prioritize defending myself against and having justice served to others more substantially involved. For those very much non-trivially involved, they are involved in what has ultimately become a rather blatant conspiracy to murder me that I've already wrongly had to serve a 13.5-month jail sentence because of, due to government corruption surrounding the handling of the case directly related to what should have been clearly recognized as me standing up for myself and defending myself from it in the past. Instead of actual justice, the conspiracy to murder me was simply enabled and facilitated even further by government officials of multiple kinds who also egregiously made an absolute mockery of my existence. Based on all the evidence I've provided in this documentation over time, I believe the best approach is probably to start by filing for civil litigation against Kimmy and Jamie for intentional infliction of emotional distress to the point they thought they could start a podcast of endless, entirely non-consensual exploitation of me, which should be able to withstand a motion to dismiss. Discovery then likely would reveal they've been involved directly in defamation of me behind the scenes, adding on to what I can legally pursue damages for. There's evidence to suggest that also very well could lead into evidence for conspiracy to murder me, as well as involvement in multiple other crimes committed against me by them and others. I imagine that discovery in general would also reveal why Celine and Janet have such a strange, heavy relevance to this whole thing that they ended up irrefutably proving to be part of a setup attempting to criminally entrap me through Grand Theft Auto role-playing. Perhaps it can also reveal details surrounding how Celine, Janet, and Jessica also appear to have expected to start a podcast off of destroying my life, which has also completely failed. Even more importantly, I imagine it should provide further clarity on how Chloe, Emaine, Jamie, Lily, and Arya all clearly have heavily directly collaborated with each other, if not also others, behind the scenes to attack me for their own selfish gain, entirely at my expense, entirely against my consent. And even if somehow none of those other matters end up adequately provable to pursue additional litigation as a result of, even with discovery, Kimmy and Jamie definitely already have publicly shown enough to where their behavior proves they've extremely egregiously, relentlessly been intentionally inflicting emotional distress on me ever since I met them in 2017, and they clearly intended to do so before we ever met. They clearly were hearing gossip about me behind the scenes from egregiously malicious liars, and they had already made the decision to pretend to like me, pretend to be interested in dating me, and ultimately betray me, break my heart, and try to extremely deviously, abusively, narcissistically control me with falsified leverage and trapping me in some kind of emotional chokehold I was meant to never find out the source of and never be able to escape from. There's no other reason that makes their decision to fly out to Toronto and have a meetup only 1 month after already having a Toronto meetup with Leslie Pryor, basically coming just to meet me, make any sense, especially since Kimmy clearly isn't serious about dating me, even though I couldn't be making it more obvious I've always been extremely serious and sincere about my feelings and intentions towards her. It seems to me there's some kind of strange false narrative around me having some kind of intimate relationship with Vivian, which Mary, Dixon, Kristen, John, and all others in that family should know is completely false. I haven't ever even been anywhere near Vivian in person for at least about 2 decades at this point. There's no real evidence otherwise, and I've never even shown any interest in getting closer to her either. So it really makes absolutely no sense for anyone to even be at all entertaining the possibility I'd want some kind of intimate connection with her. I imagine Mary, Dixon, and John can't really hide that they participated in supplying and managing the identifying documents enabling identity fraud, life insurance fraud, and potentially marriage fraud. Kristen has also definitely been stalking me and has tried harassing me online and in real life on multiple occasions in the past in order to deter me from creating this documentation, and I believe he did so fully knowingly, utmost maliciously to the benefit of Chloe, Kimmy, and Jamie. At the very root of the extremely egregious abuse, neglect, mistreatment, and misrepresentation of me, leaving me in the extremely life-threatening extreme deprivation that it's currently in, is most certainly my connection with Kimmy and what I've been left with no other even remotely sane option but to perceive as her extremely abusive and demonstrably unapologetically, absolutely, unconditionally, utmost malicious attitude and behavior towards me that's fully knowingly intended to constantly cause as much chaos, confusion, emotional dysregulation, and torment in my life as possible, fully, knowingly, and intentionally, entirely to my detriment, entirely against my consent. Due to the complex dynamic between Kimmy and Celine, and how I've had to navigate dealing with it, what would have been only two realistic possibilities for my lifetime romantic and sexual prospects has effectively now become four, whether anyone likes it or not. These are: me and Kimmy end up dating in person forever. I'm not sure if Celine's life has to be completely destroyed for that to happen or not. I don't particularly care, but I also never particularly wanted to destroy Celine's life either. If Celine's existence becomes seriously endangered and or she generally feels her life is destroyed, if she allows me and Kimmy to date each other, meanwhile Kimmy is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally unwilling to treat that reality with the adequate care it requires in a timely manner, then it's absolutely necessary that Celine explicitly publicly make that irrefutably evident by unapologetically, publicly, officially, brutally canceling and destroying Kimmy's life, by exposing her for utmost maliciously depriving Celine all these years of a loving, wonderful, intimate life partnership with me of the kind Celine has come to realize I've really been after having with Kimmy all along, because Kimmy made it irrefutably evident to Celine that she'd literally rather face lengthy prison time and or becoming deceased beyond capacity for resuscitation than be with me how she should. Otherwise, neither Celine nor anyone else has any place trying to deny me of promptly starting to officially date Kimmy. Me and Celine end up dating in person forever. I'm absolutely certain that Kimmy's life must be completely destroyed for that to happen. It's much too egregious and personally unacceptable of a compromise of my integrity for me to ever accept a scenario where Kimmy has put me through everything she has and got me so invested in being with her, and then tries to rob me of my soul by trying to force me into some exceptionally strange dynamic with Celine where neither of us really feel like we love each other, but also still just like each other enough we'd want to tolerate each other too much to destroy each other, while Kimmy siphons both our energy eternally with a trauma bond. I also feel like ever even seriously entertaining the possibility that me being with just Celine, without Celine exposing Kimmy's extreme malice towards me and effectively destroying Kimmy's life first, is a real option, is a huge trap that would just result in Kimmy endlessly depleting my resources and ultimately leaving me in a position where I'm unable to ever escape Celine feeling and treating me as if I literally deserve to die for being some huge scumbag, because it's infinitely easier for Kimmy to lie to Celine and the rest of the world about who I really am than ever take any real accountability for how horribly she's actually treated me all this time, entirely against my consent and to my detriment. I'm absolutely unconditionally unwilling to share Celine with Poe, so if Celine's connection with Poe is harmed because of Kimmy's exceedingly unhinged attitude and behavior towards me, I'm going to have to make sure it's evident enough that neither me nor Celine were actually the problem. I end up dating Kimmy and Celine in person at the same time forever. This is admittedly a seemingly quite unlikely possibility. I've never been particularly attempting to work towards it, nor particularly willing to embrace it. I'd only ever even consider accepting it if it was seriously, absolutely necessary for me to have a healthy, intimate connection of the kind I've wanted with Kimmy. It's been seeming increasingly likely to me that that's very likely the case, at least certainly compared to how likely either of the previous two possibilities seemed to me. I definitely infinitely prefer embracing this possibility rather than the only real remaining option I'd ever actually see as an option. I end up single forever and dying alone. This is a very real possibility that seems to me to be the most likely outcome here, much to my dismay, even despite my absolute greatest possible efforts to achieve a different outcome. It absolutely requires that both Kimmy and Celine would literally rather end up with lengthy prison sentences and or physically deceased beyond capacity for resuscitation than ever actually show me the love and respect I want and deserve from them. But that seems to truly be the case as far as I'm able to determine. In that case, especially after how horrible everything Chloe has put me through is, I'm absolutely certain that I absolutely unconditionally will never at all consensually entertain any romantic and or sexual relationship with anyone ever again. For Chloe to have done what she did, and then Kimmy and Celine to have been so egregiously, criminally, fully knowingly, and intentionally, almost maliciously enabled and facilitated to make it so unbelievably, unbearably worse on top, and for me to never have even actually gotten to irrefutably, fully consensually do anything sexual in person with any of those women, despite the unbelievable suffering they've put me through entirely against my consent and entirely to my detriment. I'm never going to be attracted to men, but women definitely traumatized me much too severely for even the most primal, intense sexual desires to compel me to live in what so extremely painfully, irrefutably becomes nothing more than ridiculously pathetic eternal lust for them. I've never found children, animals, and or inanimate objects to be preferable for any kind of sexual intimacy with, so that leaves me completely unable to have any at all fulfilling sexual intimacy ever. I do always have and always will find a life being so exceedingly, extremely brutally, completely deprived of any consensual sexual intimacy at all with anyone I'd ever actually really want it with, to be truly, exceedingly, extremely, deeply disturbing and unpleasant beyond words. At that point, I sincerely believe anyone that would attempt to deter me from maintaining my integrity, dignity, and self-respect by calling me an incel or pathetic or whatever, for making it my life's purpose to meticulously tear apart and ultimately absolutely eviscerate the lives of Chloe, Kimmy, and Celine, pretty much at all costs, should promptly kill themselves in real life as far as I'll ever be concerned. And I say that with absolutely no respect whatsoever towards anyone attempting to push such unbelievably psychotic levels of self-destructive delusion onto me. Back in 2017, I attended a Toronto meetup with Kimmy and Jamie present. Prior to that, I'd been regularly participating in their Twitch chats for about a month. I'd never privately messaged Jamie, and I only briefly privately messaged Kimmy once, a bit before the meetup, offering to talk to her about anything if she wanted to talk. She didn't respond to that. After the meetup, I knew my intentions in attending were left quite unclear, and I also felt it was quite extremely unclear what Kimmy and Jamie's intentions were in having it as well. So I decided it was appropriate to make sure I reasonably did my best to clarify them to Kimmy. I explained very clearly to her that I really care about her and I'm seriously interested in dating her and having an intimate life partnership with her. The next day, after I privately contacted Kimmy and explained my feelings to her, she ended up having a very uncharacteristic over 4 hour long stream where she was just talking the whole time about relationships and what she looks for in a partner and things of that nature. She normally just turned on her stream and started playing League of Legends, so it only made sense to me to assume she saw my message and felt deeply touched by it. But when I tried to talk to her about it, she denied having seen my messages prior and instead claimed she felt like talking about it because she saw Leslie talking about it. I ended up having several private conversations with Kimmy throughout 2017 afterwards, with her clearly knowingly entertaining the prospect of dating me and reciprocating my feelings more clearly, seeming to just question my sincerity for reasons that were never really made clear to me at all. I assumed she was simply understandably worried I was trying to take advantage of her social status, and one of the first things she told me was she was struggling to get over an ex of hers, so I also assumed she'd had serious struggles in the past with people telling her whatever they thought she wanted to hear simply because she's extremely physically attractive and they just wanted a shallow relationship with her. But ultimately, Kimmy strangely grew more distant when she should have been more open to growing closer if her intentions towards me had been at all decent. She started doing increasingly shady and cruel things, and I ultimately decided it was best for me to respectfully distance myself from her. I told her she left me feeling weird and I didn't want whatever kind of strange connection she was trying to have with me, so I was leaving. I stopped trying to talk to anyone and I stopped participating in anyone's Twitch chat, but I'd still sometimes watch Kimmy's streams. One day, less than 2 months after I stopped talking to her, she had this strange mental breakdown on her stream where she was on the verge of tears as she talked about pushing away someone she really liked and telling her chat not to do something you'll really regret. It was exceptionally strange, and I felt quite certain she was going to demonize me forever, as if I was just trying to break her heart all along if I didn't confront her over her having a public breakdown over her own distance from me, driving us apart. So I tried respectfully confronting her, which only resulted in her being extremely immature, avoidant, and basically starting her reign of terror, extremely deviously, constantly trying to coerce me into silence about how she'd treated me while playing victim and trying to make me look like I was somehow always the problem. For a very long time, I really didn't know what was happening. I felt so confused. I just had a sense that there was malicious, intentional withholding of important information from me, and that clearly has only proven to be true, although it took me an immense and extreme amount and length of struggle to really be able to find out what has really been happening. Eventually, a few years after Kimmy had that public breakdown over her own mistreatment of me driving us apart, there reached a point where Celine got involved in the dynamic between me and Kimmy as I'd ended up emailing a growing mailing list including many influencers as I'd constantly call out Kimmy for her still ongoing avoidant attitude that had already long since escalated into nothing short of extremely egregious narcissistic abuse. Celine seemed to me to be trying to make an absolute mockery of my feelings for Kimmy as if they must be fake because I seemed like I should have been more interested in Celine if Kimmy was being so difficult. I had a sense that Celine was just trying to compromise my integrity and string me along even more unapologetically than Kimmy was. But I was basically forced into a spot where I had to give Celine a chance to seriously communicate with me, to express sincere desire and intent to date me, or expose herself by choosing to disrespect and neglect me in response to me showing clear receptivity to dating her. I gave Celine that chance, and quite unsurprisingly to me, she essentially made an absolute mockery of it. Accordingly, I immediately completely abandoned any kind of pursuit of any intimate relationship with Celine and returned to constantly calling out Kimmy for her ongoing, increasingly harmful avoidance of the reality of how severely she'd really hurt me. As things are, Celine has proven herself to be at least equally, if not even more so, malicious towards me as Kimmy, at least as far as I can determine and the evidence suggests, as if she gets some extremely disgusting pleasure and satisfaction from seeing me absolutely tormented, terrorized, and ultimately abused, bullied, disrespected, and neglected to literal death. In real life, even despite knowing I'm entirely undeserving and obviously undesiring of such. I've never wanted to believe Celine is a horrible person, but my personal experiences dealing with her certainly don't seem to suggest she isn't, and I don't owe her and or anyone else anything for me to stay quiet about how horrible her and her friends really have been to me. In more recent times, her friend and basically boyfriend Poe explicitly directly emailed me to my personal Gmail address, and he basically told me to commit suicide. He sent me an email on June 18th, about 2 hours from the time I released my 58th release on the podcast, from his old official contact Gmail account he now seems to use for more personal matters. The same one that's on my official mailing list that I send to from my brand's official contact email listed on my podcast's YouTube channel. That's the first, and to this day only, actual direct communication I've received from any prominent, influential public figure in the last roughly 8 years, ever since Kimmy stopped replying to me in Discord DMs shortly before I decided I needed to distance myself from her due to her extremely disrespectful and harmful attitude and behavior towards me. I wasn't particularly expecting anything from Poe, and I don't know what compelled him to be quite abrasive and rudely tell me to shut up in general, and especially stop emailing him, calling me a parasocial freak stalker that needs to get a job and a life, but he seems to be convinced that nobody cares about me or my delusions. Since I've called him out, he's refused to provide any clear explanation for his behavior to me in any capacity, which I wouldn't say surprises me, although I also wouldn't say it's very intelligent of him. Telling me to get a job and get a life and calling me a weird creature, while knowing the first result on Google when you search my legal name is an absolutely criminal mockery of my existence that would make any potential employer not even consider hiring me, and any potential friend or associate not even consider wanting to be my friend or associate with me in general. It's effectively nothing short of telling me to commit suicide under circumstances he already clearly demonstrated knowledge of being exceptionally distressing, to the extent of already likely having caused most individuals to end their own lives were they ever subjected to it. Yet even recently publicly documenting the reckless disregard for the truth of this matter demonstrated by both Celine and Poe in public as they tried to shift blame onto each other and vaguely at their associates and others still has not prompted any kind of actually meaningful or even remotely adequate communication with me on this matter from anyone, neither privately nor publicly. I really have actually lost access to my personal Gmail inbox shortly after calling out Poe for emailing me that, at it, having access to it blocked from me, unless I supply Google with a mobile number under strange pretenses I consider unwarranted that claim suspicious activity on that account. I called out a public figure with over 13,000 followers taking time out of their day to directly contact me to try to bully me into suicide. And Google suddenly locked me out of my personal Gmail account for no good reason within less than 24 hours. I did absolutely nothing unusual on my account during or around that time. I never leave my devices unlocked, unsupervised. I never give access to my account to anyone else, and nobody else knows my password. At this time, especially considering past communication I've received from someone claiming to be a Google employee intentionally abusing their credentials to sabotage me for their own selfish personal gain among Kimmy and her associates, I see reason to suspect one or more corrupt Google employees intentionally helping Kimmy and her associates with relentlessly sabotaging me through defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, along with conspiring to murder me, and I intend to ultimately also sue and possibly press criminal charges on any such individuals as well. After everything I've been through, the only explanation that really makes sense to me is that Kimmy and Jamie had actually been hearing extremely malicious defamatory gossip of me behind the scenes that was being spread entirely at my expense against my consent since well before they even met me. They'd already decided they hated me and were going to betray me and try to ostracize me and destroy my life before I'd even spoken a word to them. They went out of their way to meet me and pretend to like me and want to date me and be my friend and associate with me, just enough for them to add on to the malicious, defamatory gossip of me with their own lies about me that have absolutely no real evidence to substantiate them. They've probably been lying that I somehow coerced them into meeting me and pretending to like me, and possibly even have been lying that I behaved shamefully, and maybe even going as far as lying that I did something illegal to and or around them around the time we met. It seems to me that as soon as either of them was convinced they had me invested enough in being connected to them somehow for them to leave me in the most harmful confusion and detrimental, increasingly severe deprivation and ostracization possible, they tried to promptly cut me off and leave me to die, as they hoped I'd forever desperately seek their validation and guidance. They expected to get to rob me of my soul no matter what I do at that point, because they thought they could trap me into ending up so confused, bitter, or generally overwhelmed with neurotic reactive emotionality that I'd end up self-destructive and compromise my own integrity by letting them frame me for intentionally maliciously approaching them and supposedly gaining off causing some kind of harm in their lives simply because it's difficult and complicated to try to prove that I didn't know or ever consent to the intentions and reality behind the actions they and all others I might have ever had in my life that have spread malicious defamatory gossip about me entirely at my expense against my consent had towards me all along in doing so. If I have hope that things will improve for me, I'm treated like an arrogant, entitled jackass. If I don't have hope that things will improve for me, I'm treated like I'm an extremely mentally ill loser that has always deserved how I've been egregiously abused by everyone who wanted me left hopeless. If I give chances to those wronging me so egregiously to actually behave a lot more decent and dignified towards me, I'm strung along indefinitely and treated as coercive, weak, pathetic, and stupid. If I don't give them chances anymore, I'm treated like heartless, selfish, fake, subhuman filth that had disingenuous intentions and strange, hidden ulterior motives all along in how I've ever dealt with them. I'm literally abused, coerced, disrespected, neglected, and left in increasingly severe, extremely life-threatening deprivation, literally no matter how I attempt to navigate dealing with this matter in any manner short of formally filing a lawsuit against Kimmy, Jamie, and likely ultimately several others. And even then, the prospects of me living a life I truly find at all fulfilling disappear forever. The intentions, feelings, and desires I've expressed all along truly are sincere, and I truly do wish and have openness to hearing directly from Kimmy and or Celine in the very near future before I'd actually end up formally filing a lawsuit after doing some searching for an attorney. However, I absolutely unconditionally refuse to allow myself to be strung along, waiting effectively indefinitely for some kind of communication and favorable outcome when it seems they're trying to the very bitter end to destroy my life to cover up their egregious mistreatment of me and avoid ever having to take accountability for their attitude and behavior towards me that they in reality fully recognize is exceedingly malicious, harmful, and entirely undeserved by me. Accordingly, I will no longer be delaying promptly, seriously beginning my search for a suitable attorney for the lawsuit. Although I wouldn't say I'm completely closed off to potentially looking favorably towards receiving direct communication from others, the only individuals I really want to hear from who aren't formally licensed attorneys prospecting on taking on the lawsuit are Kimmy and Celine. I feel absolutely no eagerness whatsoever to create any further documentation until at the very least I've reached out to several attorneys to pursue litigation as I've described in this documentation, gotten responses from them, and ultimately found a suitable attorney and began the process of formally filing the paperwork for the lawsuit. Although I certainly don't expect anyone's help with anything, I wouldn't say I want to be the only one actually taking meaningful actions in relation to this matter that I can personally perceive as a result of this documentation. However, I have no intention nor willingness to wait around for any period of time for any reason without seeing myself receiving meaningful direct communication to my official contact methods regarding this matter. I believe I've proven beyond reasonable doubt that I can win a lawsuit over what I've had to suffer through, and I'm not trying to drag things on until potentially the statute of limitations expires for certain things. It's become increasingly obvious to me over time that there are increasingly severe, utterly false narratives surrounding my connection with others and the attributes they and or others possess in relation to the hair on their head. None of my behavior has ever been out of envy towards anyone for any attributes of their hair. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. As far as my personal preference for the hair of an intimate partner, I consider the ideal to be longer than shoulder length and no longer than waist length hair. Kimmy's hair length has consistently been within that ideal length range the entire time I've known her, although neither that quality of her hair nor any other quality of her hair has ever been a reason why I've felt especially attracted to her. I've never wanted nor been trying to apply pressure on Kimmy and or anyone else to cut their hair especially short, grow their hair especially long, nor dye their hair any particular color to any extent as any kind of favor to me or anything that at all especially benefits me to any extent. There is absolutely no real evidence otherwise. If someone I was actually dating wanted to start cutting their hair really short or growing their hair really long to extents I find less than ideal, I'd certainly speak up on it and express that I don't prefer what they'd be doing. Same goes for if they wanted to do something with their hair color that I feel would look particularly unpleasant to me. But those things haven't ever been an issue I've had before. I suspect that Kimmy might be somehow getting blackmailed by Lily directly and or indirectly to push me away, and there's probably involvement from both Jamie and Arya in that somehow. I want it known that I do not at all appreciate such a thing if it's happening. I never have, and I never will. I also do not, never have, and never will appreciate it if Kimmy is attempting to avoid accountability for her own fault by shifting blame onto others through what becomes essentially coercing or blackmailing them with threats of changing any attributes of her hair. It seems to me that there are substantially significant false narratives surrounding my connection with others related to diet that I have and or somehow expect or require from others. This is definitely relevant in terms of the physical food they consume, but may also have some kind of influences from spirituality that are in reality equally as irrelevant to my position. None of my behavior has ever been out of envy towards anyone for their diet. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. I have never and do not associate growing up with needing or trying to stay away from any kind of fast food, meat, and or any other kind of food in general. Nor have I ever even been attempting to have any kind of effect on anyone else to change how they might perceive or experience such, whether to make it similar to myself or differ to any extent. I myself do not particularly avoid consuming fast food, meat, or any kind of food. I never have and never intend to start doing so. The only reason I'd ever particularly want to avoid eating any kind of food is if I actually just don't like how it tastes, and I currently don't feel the need to share with anyone what food I especially like or dislike. I don't have any kind of double standard on what an intimate partner of mine can eat versus what I can eat. I don't have any strange or abusive inclinations to attempt to control what they can or can't eat. I never have. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. I do not, never have, and never will consent to anyone attempting to present me as silent in Kimmy's and or anyone else's Twitch chat and or socials in general because of me enjoying anyone's ASMR to the extent that it would ever at all be allowed to compromise my integrity to any extent. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. None of my behavior has ever been out of envy towards anyone creating ASMR, neither for the ASMR they have created nor which they could potentially create. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. I understand what ASMR is and the kind of effect it's supposed to achieve. I don't find anything inherently wrong with it. I'm not inclined to negatively judge those that make and or consume ASMR content. I myself have even found myself quite enjoying ASMR sometimes in the past if it's been made by Kimmy, and I have no issue with admitting I've even told her that personally long ago, while I also tried to be helpful with giving her positive feedback on it when she first started dabbling in making ASMR content. But I have never had and do not have any kind of dependency on ASMR content of any kind to any extent from anyone. I'm completely opposed to anyone other than Kimmy or Celine ever showing me appreciation to any extent through making ASMR of any kind. I'm not completely opposed to Kimmy or Celine ever showing me appreciation to some extent through making ASMR, whether it's public content put out in general or something being done privately for me. But either way, unless it's occurring within the context of the person already privately and publicly explicitly clearly dating me, I have never and do not consider it to actually be showing me any appreciation whatsoever, and I will always see any attempts from them and or anyone else to at all portray otherwise as being fully knowingly and intentionally utmost malicious towards me. I'm well aware that those seeking to exploit societal systems in place in order to deviously exert coercive control over me extends far beyond just Kimmy. However, Kimmy has chosen to embrace making herself the public face of the most egregious and aggressive attempts to do so in her ongoing, unapologetic, extensive, extremely egregious, devious disrespect and neglect towards me. Kimmy has mentioned her access to police, the FBI, and lawyers on multiple occasions, particularly in response to escalated pressure from my efforts exposing how she's been systematically weaponizing those things against me in order to exert an extremely devious coercive control over me, for confronting her about her extremely disrespectful, immature, and inappropriately avoidant and dismissive attitude and behavior in how she's dealt with her connection with me. The state of my life irrefutably demonstrates the severity of corruption in the Canadian and United States government across many actors that have enabled and facilitated Kimmy in weaponizing government agencies against me in her criminal entrapment of me that she was the leader of orchestrating. Kimmy's closer ties to law enforcement and related agencies only further qualifies her as, at the very least, an agent operating on their behalf in a non-trivial capacity, incriminating herself even more blatantly for entrapment in every single instance she's attempted to bait me into any kind of criminal activity to any meaningful extent. And the evidence for her doing that literally only increases daily at this point. I'm very much considering pressing criminal charges on her for it. I want it known that neither the police nor the FBI nor any other government agency has any real leverage over me. I will not be intimidated or silenced by threats of violence, incarceration, or anything else. I've already been wrongfully detained at length and extremely viciously punished with immense prejudice for a manifesto that never would have even existed if the same government agencies were actually competently doing their jobs and weren't extremely corrupt. Even after I exposed so much, they tried to frame me as mentally ill and basically the entire cause of my own problems, while doing absolutely no real or adequate investigative work and execution of justice upon those that have been terrorizing me to the point I ever felt the need to write anything at all possibly incriminating in my entire life in the first place. As far as Kimmy talking about other people who have actually certainly stalked her, I don't doubt the existence of such individuals, and I've never been trying to defend and or empower any of them either. I've never been trying to empower anyone to stalk anyone. But I've also never been trying to help Kimmy harm others by exploiting them like she's been doing to me, and then trying to silence them by acting like there's some insane unhinged predator if they ever call her out for being a scumbag to them. That also applies to anyone else doing behavior like that as well. I don't particularly care what podcasts or audiobooks or other content Kimmy or Celine listen to, nor those they ever publicly mention, although I'd very confidently assert it would be quite foolish for them to neglect to take adequate consideration towards this documentation. I've never depended on anyone as any kind of source of insight for what kind of book to read or audiobook or podcast to listen to. Especially if Kimmy's listening to podcasts to put her to sleep, then I'd say it's a good thing she doesn't talk about listening to my podcast to fall asleep. I sure hope she's not falling asleep to the extensive demonstration and representation of how exceedingly, extremely, deeply distressing and disturbing her behavior that I've experienced as deeply disrespectful and neglectful of my well-being really is. In the past, I explicitly offered Kimmy specifically wearing lip gloss at certain times as a means for her to subtly show me personally that she wants me to feel she feels deeply sexually attracted to me and genuinely wants intimacy with me in person and actually wants the kind of relationship I've been saying I've wanted with her. On multiple occasions, she's specifically chosen to apply it on stream right after I privately specifically requested her to do so if she wants to communicate intimate desires towards me during times I felt there wasn't really any other appropriate means for her to try to do so. I've never been trying to force her to use or not use lip gloss, but the intent she's communicating with that behavior at certain times for a long time now has been increasingly suspicious, as if to indicate she'd perhaps been exceedingly disingenuous, knowingly, intentionally, maliciously so, towards me, in her thoughts and intentions behind how she initially convinced me long ago with that behavior to see her doing it as a sign of warmth towards me. It was something I considered quite substantial when she initially chose to respond to my communication with her by making it relevant to communicating intimate feelings towards me. So although I've tried for a long time not to see it as meaning much of anything, it's only made things increasingly complicated to try to deal with for me. I honestly don't know what relevance to me, if at all, her application of lip gloss in recent times has, but I honestly also don't really have to care at this point as far as I'm concerned. It's clearly been intentionally left so extremely viciously unclear to me by her in order to enable and facilitate her continued attempts to leave me in a kind of emotional chokehold where I have to constantly deal with intentional infliction of emotional distress on me from multiple sources, as Kimmy seems perfectly happy to completely neglect the harmful impact her extremely deviously abusive behaviors towards me have been for a very long time. It seems like one of multiple means she's been trying to trap me in endless terrorism of my life by all those who have been selfishly gaining at my expense against my consent from all my suffering all this time, to make me seem unhinged and evil no matter what I do. And that's extremely deeply disturbing and hurtful beyond words to me, as I really couldn't be further from wanting to have to see Kimmy so harshly. This lack of clarity and lack of any real accountability from her is something that constantly exerts extreme coercive control over my life. Meanwhile, she and others constantly attempt to flip everything on me as if me calling it out and simply demanding real clarity and justice on the matter is me somehow being the coercive one. My feelings and desires don't change because of the complexity, but it's really difficult for me to determine how Kimmy really feels about all this, especially without us ever even having had the chance to be intimate together privately, and perhaps even without her really feeling confident I've even really wanted to be intimate with her to begin with. I'd definitely have a problem with it if she decided she'd engage in intimacy with me but was only pretending to want or enjoy it at all, especially if it's after already having experienced it before to an extent she should know whether she likes it or not. But I've always wanted it to be apparent that my uncertainty of her true feelings is respect and consideration, not intended to make her uncertain if I actually care about our connection. I've also always wanted it to be apparent that I'm not at all trying to torment Celine when I show affection towards Kimmy. I'm seriously just being authentically myself and expressing my sincere desires. I wouldn't be upset at anyone if Celine has intimate desires towards me, as long as they're fundamentally healthy. I wouldn't refuse sexual intimacy with Celine just to spite her or for any other petty reasons. I certainly recognize I've been extremely reluctant to show Celine serious affection for a very long time, but that's because I've always wanted the reality of my feelings for Kimmy to be evident and not seem insincere or indecisive at all. I've never been trying to allow anyone to sabotage my connection with Kimmy, even if it's someone as extremely physically attractive to me as Celine is. It's quite a delicate dynamic, but I want it to be very apparent that I've never been trying to let Kimmy sabotage whatever connection I have with Celine either. Ever since the beginning of our connection, I've been extremely focused on dismantling all the attempts to sabotage my connection with Kimmy, and so much so that I've perhaps been paranoid about everyone else to the extent that I never even seriously considered the possibility that Celine actually likes me and there's any kind of serious potential for a healthy, intimate connection for me with Celine. But I really don't know how Celine feels about all this either, and I'm really not trying to disingenuously pivot away from a serious commitment with Kimmy through the affection I've ever shown anyone else. Celine is certainly no exception to that. I recognize that it's very possible Celine finds it quite frustrating that she's never had anything she can really do to clearly show sexual desire towards me somehow, like how Kimmy has been able to put on lip gloss at certain times that communicated something deeper to me. The situation is just too complicated for me to even consider attempting to present Celine with the ability to have such a thing, but I also don't feel it's necessary anyways. If she really likes me that much, at the very least, she should just directly contact me privately and just admit it. I'm seriously entirely uninterested in ever repeating any similar kinds of toxic cycles that Kimmy's already made my life so exceedingly difficult for much too long perpetuating. There's nothing Celine could ever do at this point to convince me she wouldn't be looking for an opportunity to have such a thing just to exploit it like Kimmy has been. I feel no need to particularly judge Kimmy for supposedly finding Jamie to be the cutest girl Kimmy had ever seen when they were first getting to know each other. But as for me personally, Jamie is not and has never been the cutest girl I've ever seen. I've never said or done anything that should have ever given anyone the impression otherwise. I don't know or particularly care for saying anyone's the cutest girl I've ever seen if we're talking about cute in some strange sense with some hidden perverted meaning. If we're talking about actually just the most physically attractive girl I've ever seen or can even fathom, it's been Kimmy ever since I met Kimmy. And I'm completely confident that I'll forever only continue to see Celine as, at the very least, the second most physically attractive girl I've ever seen or can even fathom, even if I were to ever meet Celine in person. The only person that has ever been and likely will ever be even close to as physically attractive to me as Kimmy and Celine are is Chloe, who has a substantially different figure but is an extremely rare exception that I'm absolutely certain will be the only of its kind ever for me. None of my behavior has ever been out of envy towards anyone for being cute, whether that's referring to them being physically attractive and or something else. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. I've really never been trying to hate on Jamie. I'm being honest about myself because otherwise there's way too much lying I'm seeing being thrown around about me that just absolutely ravages my entire existence entirely against my consent. I don't particularly enjoy comparing the attractiveness of women, but I'm also not going to cower away from it, especially not amongst such turmoil in my connection with Kimmy and Celine. I've accepted that my connection with Celine is actually a lot more important than I previously thought, which I'm perfectly fine with. I never had any reason to hate Celine inherently. I've always found Celine extremely physically attractive, and I'm certain I would have pursued Celine with a similar passion to how I pursued Kimmy had Kimmy not been around. The main reasoning I've been very hesitant for a very long time to show more affection towards Celine is because I didn't want my feelings towards Kimmy to seem flimsy or disingenuous. I'd already met Kimmy in person very early on, while I saw no prospect of meeting Celine anytime soon, and Celine seemed rather uninterested in me, from my perspective, in the limited public interaction I've had with her in the past in her Twitch stream chat long ago when I sent some messages. The attraction I've expressed feeling towards Chloe has never been intended as any kind of disingenuous pursuit of any kind of connection with Jamie and or anyone else. If Kimmy has some kind of serious romantic and or sexual connection with Jamie, I'm quite certain that's going to be a serious problem for multiple reasons and needs to change very quickly. I feel no need to mess around with saying it very nicely or trying too hard to be considerate. They must have based such a relationship on extremely egregious disrespect and inconsideration towards me, where their connection thrived off me being terrorized and ultimately killed to cover up their wrongs against me. So they don't deserve any consideration from me towards any potential intimate relationship between them as far as I'll ever be concerned. I'm not a coward, a pushover, nor a fraud at all, and I'm most certainly never going to at all tolerate becoming one to any extent for what essentially amounts to their extremely selfish convenience in an extremely coercive antagonistic dynamic existentially assaulting me. As for any serious romantic and or sexual connection between Kimmy and Celine, it really depends on the specifics of it and how it interacts with my position. My position will never change no matter what kind of intimate dynamic exactly exists between Kimmy and Celine, especially since I truly don't owe either of them to abandon my dignity, integrity, and self-respect. Although I've genuinely always been very open to the possibility of dating them both at the same time, I've also always felt it would be absolutely necessary to be extremely sensitive about coming off insincere, indecisive, and inconsiderate towards either of them in such a dynamic, which has heavily contributed to the complexity of the matter being what it is. I know the passion I've shown up to this point towards wanting intimacy with Kimmy perhaps would make it seem like I'd be heavily biased towards pursuing and embracing intimacy with Kimmy over Celine if I were dating them simultaneously. But if they really both want to date me at the same time, and that's really the only kind of arrangement that's seriously viable long term for me to date Kimmy, I really want them both to know that's certainly not how things would be between us. I sincerely believe I'd have no issue whatsoever with engaging or indulging in intimacy with both of them equally. I know that my feelings towards both of them come from the healthiest possible place. I really would infinitely rather date them both simultaneously than date neither of them. I'm really trying to be sensitive and considerate towards both of them here, but I really want to emphasize that it's not at all coming from a place of indecisiveness about how I feel and what I want, just as it's not at all coming from a place of weakness or insincerity. I'm really not sure if Kimmy's fully voluntarily choosing to do it for extremely selfish gain or if others are seriously pressuring her somehow. But Kimmy's attitude and behavior towards me seriously comes off like some kind of extremely devious, passive aggressive, attempted shaming, guilt tripping, and coercive control over me, where Kimmy's trying to eternally hold it over my head that she absolutely unconditionally, almost maliciously, withheld information from me about extremely malicious defamatory gossip being spread about me, as she criminally entrapped me into aggravatedly releasing what the courts called a manifesto shortly before the COVID-19 pandemic started. I find that deeply disturbing and hurtful, and she's now forced me to publicly shame and humiliate her brutally, despite the fact that I've never really wanted to do that at all. I'm not sorry at all for what I said in that document. I don't take it back at all, And I only even more confidently believe Kimmy and everyone else I said harsh things towards completely deserved to hear all the harsh and scary things I said in it. And that's certainly never changing with how I've been pushed to the point of literally pursuing a formal lawsuit against Kimmy and ultimately several others over all these things that could have been so easily avoided if Kimmy was actually reasonably open and honest with me early on and didn't withhold information from me about malicious gossip that was being spread about me behind my back entirely without my knowledge, entirely at my expense, entirely against my consent. Or if anyone had informed me, really. But Kimmy is especially guilty for most egregiously, unapologetically, blatantly, fully knowingly weaponizing it against me. Was I saying those things in that document out of some secret, insane, dark, perverted fetish to do those things even if Kimmy was actually good to me? No, of course not. That wouldn't even actually make sense if you actually think about it. Would I prefer things ended up as dark as I predicted they would in it as opposed to Kimmy actually being a decent person? No, that should also be obvious. It was clearly intended to show how sincere I always was in my good intentions and mirror Kimmy's and others' absolutely horrific, entirely undeserved bad intentions towards me back to them, to force them to sober up to reality if there was even any real possibility of that ever happening within any realistic circumstances. Was there anything actually in that document that should suggest otherwise to anyone actually sane, decent, and being honest and unbiased in their interpretation of it? I seriously don't believe so, and some clearly biased and corruption-driven verdict I was effectively criminally coerced under duress to accept doesn't suddenly change the reality of the matter. There was clearly a miscarriage of justice that occurred there, so even though I haven't formally appealed the ruling and it's years later, I still technically have grounds to try going through a specialized process to appeal it if I really wanted. I just don't see it as a priority in my life currently, but even still, I imagine most likely at least some of what I release on this documentation would ultimately get used in a potential appeal for it in the future. Again, I've never wanted to hurt Kimmy nor think badly of her, but from my perspective, if Kimmy hadn't been intentionally hiding all kinds of things from me while intentionally trying to provoke me into emotional dysregulation constantly for years and trying to make a complete mockery of my existence, I never would have felt any need to say any of the darker or scarier things in that document that the courts so extremely grossly negligently refused to put into even remotely adequate context. I feel absolutely no guilt, shame, and or remorse for any of it. I really don't. And again, if Kimmy got herself into some shady deal with Jamie and or others where she had to hide things from me and help others try to absolutely ravage my life, that was Kimmy's choice and she's the one that needs to take responsibility for making it, not me. Kimmy and everyone else that's done what they did to me that led to me saying any of those concerning things actually deserves to hear much worse with how they've been behaving towards me all these years, at least as far as I'm concerned. And not only hear it, but experience it, especially with how Kimmy's to this day acting towards me. I just wouldn't say those kinds of things so explicitly in public anymore now that I've already made my point the first time. Now, I'd just actually follow through and make it come to reality if I still don't get treated actually decently with the respect I deserve from the world in a timely manner. And I most certainly am not getting the respect I deserve from the world currently, for the record. Not even remotely close. I've never felt forced to have a latex fetish. I've never wanted Kimmy to feel like my latex fetish, and indulging in it with me is any kind of punishment for either of us, but I wouldn't stop having a latex fetish, nor stop desiring for Kimmy to indulge it, even if she felt otherwise. I most certainly am not lying about having a latex fetish, nor have I ever been at all exaggerating my desire to have sexual intimacy in person with Kimmy involving her wearing classy latex clothing. And absolutely nobody has ever had any even remotely adequate reason to believe otherwise in relation to any of those things either. I'm not going to pretend like it makes any real sense to believe Kimmy and or anyone else I've been attacked by was ever doing it with good intentions, given how Kimmy utterly refuses to actually behave meaningfully as if otherwise from the absolute worst possible interpretation of her behavior is the case. It only makes sense to assume that it was clearly done with the utmost worst of intentions that try to endlessly perpetuate the same terrorism over my life that she participated in that ever led to that document being released how it was in the first place. The reality is that the courts egregiously misrepresented me in the disclosure of the case, literally defaming me by claiming I copied most of it from the internet when literally nothing present in that document was available anywhere else on the internet besides parts of it available exclusively on my own website I had running at the time. There was absolutely no actual evidence ever presented to substantiate the assertion that I copied any of it from the internet, yet I was portrayed in the most absolutely horrid bad faith manner as if I was some unhinged maniac that just stole a bunch of deep and meaningful rhetoric from others on the internet for literally hundreds of pages worth of content, and then decided to throw in a couple pages of unhinged seeming threatening stuff that was framed as essentially the only real demonstration of my personality and the only thing I actually wrote in the whole document. The only evidence they took was some clearly bad faith and even lie-ridden police statement from Chloe, who's clearly been among the main perpetrators, defaming me and intentionally inflicting emotional distress on me by proxy of the public figures or influencers on the internet who have intentionally indulged in her abuse towards me so egregiously that it's literally reached the point I'm going to have to sue and likely also ultimately press criminal charges against them. It seems to me like what's been happening is all those that endeavor to criminally entrap me, to try to steal credit for my efforts, and then attempts to criminally coerce me with illegal weaponization of law enforcement to silence me from standing up for myself, are attempting to endlessly suppress and sabotage me by egregiously defaming me endlessly and lying that they deserve credit for what I in reality created entirely by myself, and they're acting like the real reason I'm upset is because I can't somehow steal credit for the work they're claiming I tried to steal from them, which in reality they've always been trying to steal from me. There's absolutely no real evidence that anyone besides me is at all responsible for writing any part of any version of that document the courts called a manifesto, nor is there any real evidence that anyone deserves any credit for anything else I've ever claimed I've written myself either. To this day, not even one person has ever even attempted to communicate to me any actual evidence that I'm lying about that, yet everyone treats me like it should simply be understood as a given that I'm a complete fraud. Basically, all the deep, meaningful, insightful stuff in that document were things I'd already released on my website or things I wrote largely simply in efforts to try to make the world a better place with zero relation to Kimmy, her associates, and or anyone from my past. I've never attributed any of them as deserving of any credit for any of it. The portions that were autobiographical, obviously, Kimmy and others I've had in my life were mentioned, and their behavior towards me contributed to me ultimately writing the truth of my experiences with them. But it's not like I was ever trying to praise any of them as if they did some wonderful thing for me. It was more like trying to show I have no skeletons in my closet, as the expression goes. The portion with honorable mentions was basically just people I thought seemed alright, but none of them actually helped me with writing any of the document either. And the hits portion contained those that I've only increasingly over time proven were actively ongoingly contributing to the perpetual terrorism of my life, and in multiple cases either planning and or already having done serious crimes committed against me. Instead of court officials taking into appropriate consideration any of this context, instead of law enforcement doing anything even approaching actually adequate and reasonable levels of detective work into the matter, I was immediately just treated like some absolutely unhinged maniac and jailed for a lengthy sentence for a few scary, threatening-sounding sentences that never even once talked about shooting, stabbing, and or bombing anyone. Even how I described harm that would occur to individuals was intentionally nuanced, such that one might be able to argue it was something of fiction, at least certainly if you refuse to acknowledge the existence and potency of quantum energy arts. You know, like the overwhelming majority of the world population does, clearly including the kinds of attorneys, prosecutors, and judges that dealt with the case, who immediately decided to treat me as if I'm extremely severely mentally ill, and still proceeded with it despite my warnings and despite even a psychological evaluation that concluded by saying they don't really feel confident I have any mental illness. But I wasn't ever writing fiction, so I never tolerated pretending to law enforcement as if I was, because I'm not a coward nor a fraud, and I've proven it time after time. It seems perhaps another long-standing lie that frauds have been trying to exploit me endlessly through is that somehow my lack of desire and or willingness to talk in Kimmy's and or others' Twitch chat and or social medias in general is because I'm so appeased or somehow deserve to be suppressed by some kind of content or behavior they're displaying publicly in general, not necessarily ASMR, especially related to live streams. The reality is I simply don't have anything to say to them and or I don't want to validate false narratives that I owe them communication or have some kind of particular interest in them that somehow compromises my integrity. Additionally, in many cases, their communities are a heavily censored and biased environment that they run like a cult where I'd get banned instantly if I said anything actually authentic and try to hold them accountable how I'd like to, pretty much no matter how I try to go about it. None of my behavior has ever been out of envy towards anyone for being a live streamer or content creator in general. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. I don't have a favorite streamer. There are only streamers I ever pay any real attention to, and those I don't. And those I do are a very small selection I feel no need to explicitly list. Kimmy is the one I by far pay the most attention to, but I wouldn't say she's my favorite or anyone's my favorite when I basically only ever pay any attention to any of them at this point because I suspect them of conspiring against me to sabotage and destroy my life for their own selfish gain, knowingly entirely at my expense, entirely against my consent. Kimmy and Celine are definitely the most physically attractive streamers to me, and without question, the ones I'd most like to date and have an intimate life partnership with. But I don't know if I'd say that means either of them are my favorite streamer either, when that might be taken to mean implied things I don't want to ever imply about my connection with them. It seems rather apparent that I'm being extremely egregiously misrepresented as having agreed to contracts which I've in reality not at all agreed to. While I can only really generally speak my truth to invalidate most of such criminal false contracts, there is one contract that I specifically want to explicitly make sure I've clarified the reality of the specifics of publicly so as to further demonstrate any contracts that seem to contradict whatever I'm saying here must have forged signatures and or other falsified supposed validation. There was a contract I signed years ago between me and Dixon, which John even explicitly told me he believed was me selling my soul, but that most certainly is not, never has been, and never will be me selling my soul at all. Dixon never told me he and or anyone he knew of had any kind of life insurance policy out on me, nor that he was aware of anyone faking my death, nor that he and or anyone else had already collected or ever had any plan or intention to collect any money from any life insurance policy out under my name, which agreeing to that contract would have ever at all somehow validated. I never would have agreed to any contract with him had I known any of these things at the time, and there's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. The terms of the contract were that Dixon would give me a total of 20,000 Canadian dollars, which he insisted he gave gradually in increments less than, or at most no greater than $2,000 at a time, over a period of several months, and other than to finish those exchanges, we would never communicate again. Also, I would never live with him, and I would never ask him for money. And he was to rectify any defamation of me that he's done to anyone, especially Kristen and Mary, and never do any more defamation of me. At the time, I did not know he was involved in life insurance fraud and faking my death, which I will forever assert was always happening entirely against my consent. He told me all the money he has and would pay me with comes from legitimate money he earned through his business while it was still running, and that he'd take loans if he felt necessary, which he left completely unclear to me and refused to explain at all. Absolutely nowhere in the contract did it state I would ever be at all okay with Dixon and or anyone else at all being involved in committing life insurance fraud on me and or ever faking my death for any reason. It never gave Dixon or anyone else in general either any kind or extent of consent to commit any crimes against me and or anyone else at all. I'm quite certain Dixon hasn't kept his end of the contract to rectify all defamation he's done of me, especially since Kristen had the audacity to in more recent times stalk me and try to terrorize me and blame me for his own life issues that Dixon ultimately would be much more responsible for than I ever would be. Either way, I'm never renegotiating any kind of contract with Dixon ever, and I will still not accept any money from him either. Accordingly, I will not be suing him. I will simply pursue pressing criminal charges on him for his involvement in life insurance fraud, identity fraud, and trafficking that John was also helping Dixon and Mary cover up their attempts to inflict on me entirely against my consent. I've never sexually assaulted anyone, and there's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. I believe it's possible Kimmy and or Jamie are claiming I might have sexually assaulted them around the time we met, but there's definitely absolutely no real evidence to that. I never even had a moment actually alone or in private with them ever, and there are plenty of witnesses that I never sexually assaulted either of them in public at the meetup. The closest thing to a moment alone with either of them I've ever had in person is when I asked to speak to Kimmy alone at the very end of the meetup, but that was very much in public with multiple people as witnesses of the whole thing as we briefly stepped a bit away from the group. Beyond that, I believe Chloe has tried to completely ruin my life by lying that I've sexually assaulted her, by extremely egregiously warping and misrepresenting the reality behind a one-on-one private encounter we shared back in high school. The reality is, she wanted me to touch her sexually back then. It seems quite obvious to me at this point that the reason why she wanted it was actually one of absolutely unconditional, unrestrained, malicious intent from her towards me, which isn't something I've ever wanted or enjoyed at all, but her true intentions were something I couldn't even possibly have known at the time. First of all, there was never any reason I was forced to share my experience with Chloe in that private encounter that she's likely tried to egregiously misrepresent to others as if I sexually assaulted her. I could have just denied it completely. I could have just completely made up a version of events that make her look absolutely horrible, much worse than the reality does. In the end, there's no pictures or videos or voice recordings or any real evidence of it ever even happening, so it's her word against mine about exactly what happened. And it's not like I haven't known that from the very first time I ever mentioned it to anyone. I've shared my experience because I know I didn't actually do anything wrong, and in fact, Chloe's attitude and behavior there has always been quite extremely deeply disturbing, distressing, and hurtful to me, and that encounter was especially heartbreaking for me and still traumatizes me deeply to this day. To put it simply, yes, I touched Chloe's butt in that encounter, but she definitely fully knowingly behaved in a manner very much showing openness and desire to be touched there by me at that time. How she's behaved since only goes to show to me how she was always fully knowingly and intentionally, almost maliciously trying to manipulate me, break my heart, and bait me into some weird, extremely humiliating, harmful, entirely unwanted, and detrimental circumstances where she'd maintain extremely abusive, extremely devious, coercive control she'd been trying to establish over me from the very beginning, utmost maliciously, fully knowingly, entirely at my expense, entirely against my consent, with how she extremely strangely basically forced her way into my life by suddenly starting to obsess over the dude who was basically the closest thing to a best friend to me in high school. Because she'd blatantly told me she hates me on multiple occasions with no explanation and much too seriously for me to really be able to take it as a joke, after she did it the third time, I'd been making it a point to refuse to communicate with Chloe for a very long time before that encounter, and many people knew it, with how I clearly expressed desire in it to date her. She obviously knew me expressing desire for sexual intimacy with her was completely serious. Chloe was literally the only person I ever asked out in my entire time in high school. Someone creeped out to learn I wanted to date her and that her body was extremely arousing to me, or even just someone who didn't want to be touched sexually by me, would have and should have acted very differently in response to learning about my feelings towards her, how I shared them with her there. Yet she only wanted to open up to me even more and didn't even ask me to leave her alone after I touched her butt. Although she verbally said no when I asked to, she showed clear interest in and arousal towards knowing I wanted to touch her butt. She made it seem like she just didn't want to seem trashy by blatantly verbally agreeing to it under the circumstances of a connection that her immaturity had already made quite complicated at the time. She was smiling, giggling, flirty, and very open to continuing to communicate with me, interested in opening up to me about her unhappiness with her connection with those she'd chosen to pursue intimate relationships with, especially how they were showing a lack of sexual desire towards her compared to what she'd really like in a partner, sexual desire that she'd experienced me showing her in that encounter. She didn't seem concerned or creeped out at all when I asked if I could touch her butt, and although she verbally said no, her body language was very open and relaxed overall throughout the encounter. The whole situation was such that the only reason I wouldn't have touched her butt would be if I was completely lying about being so attracted to her and perhaps even secretly attracted to men. I'm quite certain Chloe was well aware her behavior made it such. Even back then, I already had to deal with people thinking I'm attracted to men simply because I didn't seem more interested in getting into a relationship with other women, which is something Chloe in reality would have known. I'm sure Chloe in reality fully understood I wouldn't want her to feel like I was giving her some kind of permission and or encouragement to act like I was being disingenuous in expressing arousal towards her for multiple reasons. If she didn't want to be touched, there were so many ways she could have handled that whole interaction so much differently at so many points, to the extent that I'd definitely say it's exceedingly disingenuous for her to ever even try to imply to anyone that she didn't in reality want to be touched how I touched her, but how she appeared to have told a very different story to others, which I got a sense of when I saw how one of them confronted me asking about it later on, convinced me that simply telling people the truth and addressing it promptly and hoping I'd be believed was not a realistic option for me if I wanted to preserve my soul that Chloe has at this point already long proven to me she tried to steal from me entirely at my expense, entirely against my consent. Overall, Chloe's tried to formulate her whole attack against me from the beginning by extremely deviously lying and misrepresenting things, trying to cause chaos, confusion, and drama in my life, and fully knowingly, intentionally, almost maliciously strategizing on harming me while faking to others that her attitude and behavior towards me is innocent and harmless, or perhaps at the very worst was always just based on something really petty from me and or her, as if I'm extremely mentally ill if I ever even claim she truly harbors absolutely unconditional, unrestrained malicious intent towards me and always has from the very beginning in her attitude and behavior towards me all along. It took something like that encounter in high school for me to ever really even have a chance to be able to see that clearly, and the more time passes, the more irrefutably clear the reality behind Chloe's attitude and behavior towards me becomes to me. Chloe's literally never even once actually tried to repair our connection at all. Literally nothing she's ever done has actually been at all conducive to proving my assertions here about her at all incorrect. Yet even despite how extremely narcissistic and psychotic Chloe's behavior made her seem to me,
After that encounter, I still gave her multiple chances over time to reconsider being so vicious and awful to me for years that followed. Instead, she just proved she's really the psychotic narcissist with absolutely unconditional, unrestrained, malicious intent towards me all along that I've always been, only increasingly, extremely, deeply disturbed and traumatized to learn she's really always been.
I've never sexually exploited anyone nor ever wanted to. I've never denied that in the very limited number of times I've ever had sexual intimacy with someone in the past, I've chosen to engage in sexual intimacy with escorts. But I've always fully paid them the amount requested for our time together. I've always been respectful to them and have never seen them as or treated them as lesser beings simply for their chosen profession. I never even attempted to force any of them to do anything they didn't want to do, and none of the behavior I experienced from any of them even suggested to me that they felt the interactions were at all non consensual. They were all very clearly legal adults at the time I was intimate with them, and that's always how I've preferred it to be. Also consistent with my sexual preferences, I've never denied they've all been Asian women, and I have absolutely no regrets or issues with that either. However, I have no desire nor plans to contact any new escorts ever again either. Those I've been with, I haven't spoken to or even attempted to reconnect with any of them in years. I never plan to speak to or reconnect with any of them ever again. None of them and nobody else has any at all even remotely adequate reason to believe otherwise. I've never consented to being video and or audio recorded during any sexual activities I've ever engaged in with anyone, nor have I ever done such recording myself. I've also never consented to having any such recording shared with anyone online and or offline, whether or not it's for any kind of payment or compensation. I've never received any kind of payment or compensation for it if any such recordings exist, whether or not they've been shared with anyone online and or offline, nor do I have any desire and or intent to ever pursue or accept any kind of payment or compensation for such recordings if they do exist. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise to any of this. I've never had bareback vaginal intercourse. I've never been particularly eager to ever experience it, and I've never seen any particular reason to believe either of those things are ever changing. No condom I've ever used in the limited times I've had protected vaginal intercourse have ever torn or broken either, and I certainly haven't ever at all wanted nor been trying to get them to tear or break either. There's absolutely no real evidence otherwise to these facts. There's absolutely no at all lawful or even logical reason why anyone should ever believe I'd ever have any biological children. I do not, never have, and never will at all have any desire and or willingness to accept any responsibility whatsoever for any pregnancies in the physical, whether or not my genetics are somehow involved. I've always known this and have never tried at all to keep it a secret, which is only all the more reason how I've conducted myself in relation to the matter is actually the most mature and appropriate thing I could do. I've never wanted to biologically reproduce with anyone at any point in time, whether it's as a result of having bareback vaginal intercourse with anyone or not. I've never at all behaved in a manner at all demonstrating otherwise. In fact, I've repeatedly, consistently stated my feelings and position on the matter extremely clearly, and even extensively elaborated on my reasoning and how and why it's objectively sensible as my personal decision on the matter and should not be taken by anyone as a fundamentally offensive position, nor as any kind of suggestion or expectation I'd ever have of humanity as a whole. I'm not married in the physical nor in the spiritual realms, at least certainly not to my knowledge. I've never at all consented to being married to anyone in any sense in any realm. And I never intend to get married in the traditional sense where there becomes a legal tie of finances and whoever I'd theoretically marry would get to just take half of everything I own if they leave me. It makes absolutely no sense for me to do, and to me feels like it just would cause insecurity in both me and them and do nothing actually good for either of us. Any openness I've shown towards any kind of marriage ever has never been intended to communicate any desire and or willingness to ever biologically reproduce with anyone. However, my lack of desire and or willingness to ever have children is not, never has been, and never will be any kind of attempt to communicate a lack of desire and or willingness to be a public figure with an audience. I've never at all intended to cause, nor at all benefited from anyone at all causing any kind or extent of confusion or lack of clarity about any of these facts. Also, my position on myself ever biologically reproducing is not, never has been, and never will be me at all avoiding or attempting to avoid a deep and meaningful, intimate commitment. There is absolutely no real evidence otherwise to any of these facts. I'm well aware that I could still perhaps choose to embrace many different realities where I'm not fully locked in to an intimate life partnership with Kimmy and or Celine. If I really didn't want what I've been saying I've wanted, but nobody forced me to initially express and pursue the desires I've had for intimacy with Kimmy, which has ultimately led me to this point. And I know with absolute certainty that I really still do want what I've been saying I've wanted. I'm seriously, absolutely, unconditionally unwilling to tolerate any attempts to force on me different realities where the suffering and trauma I've endured and the consequences of still being denied what I've been saying I've wanted and proven I deserve are effectively ignored, especially by myself. If I really can't have a deep, meaningful, sincere, in-person, intimate life partnership with Kimmy and or Celine forever, then that shows what happens with women I really want to be with who are of high social standing and should be more so capable of being held publicly accountable and should be careful how they treat me because they actually have something serious to lose if they're too unhinged in how they treat me. So, as far as I'll ever be concerned, that means it's exceedingly stupid and futile for me to ever even consider pursuing or at all tolerating any kind of romantic and or sexual connection with anyone actually significantly influential in the world. Chloe's already absolutely unconditionally, absolutely irrefutably proven to me that women who aren't of high social standing are just even more likely to try some extremely predatory, malicious behavior that can be even more damaging to me, and I'm absolutely certain that I'd never even find such a person I'll ever find even close to as physically attractive as I've found Chloe either, anyways. So there's absolutely no real appeal to me in ever even considering having any kind of romantic and or sexual involvement with essentially random nobodies either. And Chloe herself clearly hasn't at all actually wanted nor even just been willing to tolerate a sincere and healthy connection with me that would ever be anything I'd actually want. So she's never even been a real option for me and never will be. To this day, and I imagine quite certainly for the rest of my life, I will never find anyone even remotely as arousing and desirable for me to have sexual intimacy with as Kimmy, Celine, and Chloe are to me. I absolutely unconditionally refuse to ever even pretend to be okay with being so viciously completely denied any kind of connection I'd ever actually want with every single one of these women. This will never be at all up for debate nor negotiation. This is not at all an exaggeration. This is not something that will ever change with any amount of time. There's absolutely nothing anyone can do to change it, nor should they try. Although it certainly wouldn't ever stop me from pursuing a formal lawsuit, there's truly no kind or amount of compensation that would ever even slightly entice me to at all reconsider or even slightly truly alleviate the incomparably immense, deep suffering and pain beyond words that it would forever inflict on me for this kind of complete denial of my desires to persist for very much longer. There's absolutely no indecisiveness I feel in my position as such. So I'd seriously never date anyone, never even want to have anyone close to me for any kind of connection, and I'll never be anything even remotely close to something I'd ever consider truly happy, fulfilled, or even okay if it does. There is not, never has been, and never will be any real evidence otherwise, and I have absolutely no doubt nor hesitation to relentlessly go to the absolute greatest possible lengths to prove it well beyond any reasonable doubt. I have seriously always wished I wouldn't be pushed there, and there's absolutely no real evidence otherwise. I've never been trying at any point in my life to get anyone killed, at all enable and or facilitate anyone faking anyone's death for any reason, nor at all enable and or facilitate anyone to enter in and or remain in any kind of witness protection. This includes, but is not limited to, physical government coordinated witness protection. There are absolutely no exceptions. I've also myself never been and am not planning nor attempting to go into witness protection of any kind nor disappear from the public eye in general for any reason, neither by myself nor with anyone else. This doesn't mean that I don't want and or have the willingness to provide any kind of protection at all for those I love and care for who also love and care for me. However, I want it to be abundantly evident that I do not, never have, and never will at all tolerate anyone exploiting my love and care for them in order to get any kind of protection for themselves that comes at my expense against my consent. Currently, anyone and everyone at all receiving any kind or extent of protection from me through any means for any reason that to any extent is not being exclusively utilized to protect me and only me is doing so entirely at my expense, entirely against my consent.